Okay, I shall be strict on myself and keep to time. I'd just like to say a very quick thank you to Lily and Robert for organising this event and all of these summits, and also say thank you to the parliamentarians who are here and who have helped to arrange this event. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is about propaganda and COVID-19. And I think overall I want to impart to you a way in which you can understand different aspects of propaganda and COVID-19. Two very different ways of understanding the way in which COVID-19 can be understood in relation to analysis of propaganda. Obvious way of understanding how COVID-19 had a propaganda around it has been involved in creating belief and compliance with governments, and that's one sort of aspect of understanding COVID-19 and propaganda. But there's also an indirect and I think arguably more important way of understanding, which is that COVID-19 itself has served as a form of propaganda in order to do certain political and economic work. And at the end of the presentation, I'll talk through what I think that means in terms of what we need to try to do now to understand what it is that we're up against. Okay, first of all, talking about propaganda. It's a poorly understood phenomenon, perhaps not so much here in Romania, but certainly for politicians and public and the media and many academics in the West. It's something which is understood to be only relevant to authoritarian regimes or only relevant to particular circumstances such as war. And this is a fairly serious misunderstanding of the reality of propaganda across liberal democracies. Throughout the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, propaganda has in fact played a central role in the exercise of power. And there's a gentleman there, Eddie Bernays. Some of you will be familiar with Eddie Bernays, the nephew, in fact, of Sigmund Freud. And Eddie Bernays, sort of a leading intellectual or a leading thinker in relation to propaganda in the 20th century and the importance of it and the necessity of it in terms of governance of democracies. And one of the key problems, one of the key reasons why people in the West don't have a very strong grasp or they have a poor understanding of propaganda is because it's pretty much been erased from their collective consciousness. People don't think that propaganda is happening. And there's kind of like a reason for that, and you can see some of the reasons listed there. We have what the late Professor Phil Taylor described as a euphemism industry, whereby a whole variety of terms such as strategic communication, political communication, marketing, advertising, these terms are essentially used to replace propaganda and to disguise the reality of what's going on. And just to give me the time, Eddie Bernays is in fact responsible for the term public relations, and to quote him, the Germans gave propaganda a bad name because of the way they used it in World War I, so he had to come up with a new name for it, and so he came up with the term Council of Public Relations, and therein was born PR, public relations. So this euphemism industry has essentially played a central role in terms of pushing out of people's minds in the West that actually propaganda is, as I said before, central to the exercise of power across liberal democracies. Okay, so what do we actually mean by propaganda? Propaganda is essentially a form of not just getting people to believe certain things, it's also about organizing their conduct. It's getting people to behave in particular ways. So it's approach to persuading people, shaping their beliefs and their behavior in a way which is non-consensual. Okay? Now this can occur throughout an informational realm. It can involve, for example, lying. It can involve distortion of information, omission of information, misdirection, in order to essentially deceive people as to the reality of a situation. And that's how you can understand propaganda as operating sort of in terms of the management and the manipulation of information. But critically, propaganda isn't just about that. Propaganda is also about shaping material contexts in order to variously bribe or coerce people into acting and behaving in particular ways. So it works through a material realm, essentially, as well as within the informational realm. And incentivization and coercion are part of the tactics that you see in large-scale propaganda operations, or rather large-scale propaganda campaigns. The end result of these tactics of manipulation, whether or not they're working individually or they're working together, the end result is that people's free will is being violated. That there's no consent that's being given in a way which is either fully informed or sufficiently informed, nor which is actually freely given. And this kind of sort of manipulative nature of propaganda is essentially the central reason why, in at least theoretical terms, propaganda is incompatible with democracy. Now, I appreciate, for those of you who are sort of absorbing certainly the incentivization and coercion elements, as we go through the case of COVID-19, hopefully you'll get a better sense of exactly what is meant by these particular processes. So, COVID-19, starting off, as I suggested at the beginning of the presentation, with a consideration of the sort of more immediate, more obvious, perhaps the more empirically demonstrable aspects of propaganda during COVID-19. We have ample evidence of manipulation in terms of, manipulation within the informational realm. Before I get to that, so don't worry about that slide for the moment, because I just want to talk through a few things. Certainly, early on during COVID-19, behavioral scientists and behavioral science knowledge was leveraged in order to try and influence conduct and beliefs of populations. In the United Kingdom, you had the Scientific Pandemic Information Group, which was providing advice to the UK government, to the UK government's SAGE organisation, in order to use the techniques of behavioural science in order to try and get people to both be very fearful of the virus and also then to actually start to comply with lockdowns, with masks, with injections, and so on. SPI-B, in fact, in a document which went into the public domain early on in 2020, actually refers to the use of incentivization and coercion. It also refers to, as you can see on the slide there, the use of media in order to increase sense of personal threat. So you can see a conscious, deliberate decision to try and raise people's fear levels. Got a good manifestation of this strategy of increasing fear, arguably deception through exaggeration in this case. And this is the UK National Health Service and a PR campaign, look him in the eyes, look her in the eyes, and tell her you'll never bend the rules, etc. And this campaign essentially leveraging a combination of fear and guilt in order to get people to comply with government diktat, etc., during COVID-19. Now, as we've seen in quite a lot of presentations, both today and yesterday, and as we've all experienced over the last 3 years, fear elevation, trying to make people terrified of this virus is certainly a major component of what we've seen in propaganda terms during COVID-19. But we've also seen, essentially, deception through omission. In some ways, I'd argue that this is actually the bigger part of the question of propaganda in relation to promoting issues surrounding COVID-19, omitting information, and that has primarily been achieved through censorship censorship combining or censorship under the rubric of controlling disinformation. And again, we've seen this time and time again in the presentations over the last couple of days, this deeply problematic idea of disinformation being used in order to then justify censorship and removal of information from the public sphere. and from the circulation within public discourse. Quite clearly, you've got a slide here. This is the United Nations Counter-Disinformation Campaign, reporting people for online misinformation. Next slide, we've got an example from, this is the United Nations, I believe, yes, Project Verified, Fighting Misinformation on COVID-19. Sort of coming from a very top, as was just described, global governance level. And again, the strategy here ultimately is to try and get information identified as mis or dis, and then getting it out of public circulation, creating an omission of that information. Now, I mean, I'll go back for a second. I'm sure we could all list scores of examples of this that we've all experienced over the last 3 years. So this is very, very clear, easy to demonstrate evidence of deception through omission as part of propaganda during COVID-19. I suppose we could still be umming and ahhing about it amongst at least some of the academics who study propaganda about, well, exactly, how much censorship was there. I think that the Twitter files, which some of you will be familiar with, and this is the work of Michael Schellenberger, Matt Taibbi, Andrew Löwenthal, and others, essentially looking at the material which came out after Elon Musk had taken over Twitter. And what they found and what they evidenced was very direct interactions between federal government agencies in the US and Twitter with the objective of censoring information. And they've described pretty persuasively a censorship industrial complex, which actually starts to link in a very interesting variety of actors. Everything from fact-checking organizations, and I appreciate you probably won't be able to read the details on this slide, but it does at least give you a sense of the scale of this. But you have this kind of interaction between non-governmental organizations, fact-checkers, again, working with a disinformation concept, big tech, foundations, academic initiatives, and government, all as part of trying to remove disinformation from the public sphere. So pretty direct confirmation there, I think, through the Twitter files and a very sort of accurate characterization of what we have in terms of a censorship industrial complex. So perhaps this is not news to anybody here. Perhaps it will be news to people who are listening out in the wider audience. But clearly censorship going on, clearly omission of information. It gets uglier with COVID-19, and again, this is something that many of us have experienced. We're edging into the territory of, I think, more shaping of material contexts here. But we have clear examples of character assassination or smear campaigns being initiated and activated during COVID-19 in order to try to shut people up. Now, a lot of you here will be familiar with the Great Barrington Declaration. I probably don't have to go through all of the details of it. But the Great Barrington Declaration, released in 2020, Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff, eminent scientists, signing a declaration or creating a declaration saying that perhaps lockdown isn't such a good idea, and they suggested focused protection instead. Launched, as I say, in the autumn of 2020. Rather than triggering a rational reason debate, this triggered a smear campaign against them. And this here is an email sent from, let me get this right, this is from Francis Collins, National Institute of Health Director, being sent to Tony Fauci. I don't need to explain who he is. And they have noted the Great Barrington Declaration, and they have said, well, we've got a proposal from three fringe epidemiologists, and it needs to have a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. Is it underway? So here you have, quite clearly from the very, very top, an attempt to not engage with what they're arguing, but to instead engage with starting to try and smear the scientists involved with this and smear the declaration as well. Whoopsie daisy, go back again. I was going to add as well that and just picking up on this idea of smear and character assassination, a very recognized tactic within PR circles. You saw this being applied, obviously, to the populations at large. The Canadian trucker protest, for example, elicited smear terms such as fascist and far right, and so on. Now, to be absolutely clear, these kind of labeling tactics that we've seen in the character assassination campaigns during COVID-19, they're a form of ad hominem attack. It's a fallacious argumentation strategy. It helps the attacker avoid substantial and factual analysis and engagement with the issues that people are raising. And it works through essentially making false, misleading, or irrelevant claims about the character, identity, or psychological makeup of people. Sunetra Gupta herself was smeared as a conspiracy theorist by the British media at one point. None of this constitutes reason, debate, and dialogue, and I hope that that is clear. And it gets uglier. Now, this is very much into the realm of shaping material contexts in order to coerce people. Obviously, and again, I'm making a mistake, I need to go back, haven't got enough slides. Coercion, you can see quite clearly in the broadest sense with, for example, mandating over-injections, and this led to multiple people losing employment, being kicked out of jobs. Again, we've had this coming up time and time again in the last couple of days. Prominently, for example, Professor Julie Panesi from Western University in Canada, she lost her job because she would not take the injection. Similar fate befell Professor Kiriaki from University of California, Irvine. This year, 2023, in Germany, we've seen a pretty malicious attempt to prosecute Professor Sukrit Bhakdi, high-profile opponent of COVID policies. This was in Germany, trying to prosecute him on very tenuous legal grounds. And very recently, we've seen the prosecution of Berlin-based US playwright C.J. Hopkins for 2 tweets that he issued, which were criticizing Lauterbach, the German health minister. 2 tweets, and they prosecuted him for that. So we have here the creation of essentially a coercive context in which we have the sort of promotion of fear, and then we have the smear campaigns, etc. And it's very important when we think of all of these kind of sort of forms of propaganda and manipulation going on. Essentially, they work in a synergistic fashion. They work to reinforce each other. They construct an environment in which self-censorship becomes ubiquitous. So how does this work? Well, deplatforming of dissident scientists sends a clear warning as to which subject matters and issues are off limits, whilst examples of smearing highlight the potential unpleasant consequences of discussing such issues. Coercion acts as a final hard stop for anyone entertaining the possibility of risking talking about censored issues and riding out the smears that will result. Loss of job and loss of income becomes too much to bear. So this is this idea that all of these tactics work together synergistically in order to create really a very high level of manipulation that we've seen over the last 3 years. Skip that slide because I won't have time. 3 or 4 years ago, I think I was probably hoping that, or I was saying to colleagues, when the whole disinformation, fake news discourse started to emerge, I was saying, are we really going to have to get back to free speech basics in order to explain why censorship of information, censorship of debate is a bad idea? But we're pretty much having to go back to free speech 101. I think, in order to make very, very clear that none of these tactics involving certainly the censorship of information based upon the disinformation idea, none of this can be rationally, ethically justified in terms of free speech expectations. So we go back to John Stuart Mill. I'll need a few more minutes. Go back to John Stuart Mill on this. The opinion which it is attempted to suppress by authority may possibly be true. Those who desire to suppress it, of course, deny its truth, but they are not infallible. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. It's the erroneous assumption of infallibility. Can't justify this kind of censorship, and we're having to restate these principles at this point in the 21st century. Shows how far we have gone down the hole of losing our sort of democratic ideals. Now, This is sort of essentially working with this idea of the most obvious sort of aspects of propaganda that we can see during COVID-19. It's also become increasingly clear, as we've seen in the last presentation, and that has been alluded to many speakers over the last couple of days, is that COVID-19 itself has served as a form of propaganda in order to enable certain agendas to be pushed forward. And this is where the concept of, this is Peter Dale Scott's concept of the structural deep event, is very useful to bring in. The structural deep event sort of basically identifies the ways in which elites can be involved in instigating, exacerbating, or exploiting events in order to push forward particular political agendas or economic agendas. Structural deep is a deep event because he also points out that what you have is you have activities and processes which include the legitimate aspects of a state, but also involves the deep state, the intelligence services, criminal elements, who at various points interact together in order to either instigate, exploit, or exaggerate events in order to push forward issues. And they're structural because they lead to, or they are part of trying to obtain long-term structural change to a society. So, of course, we have quite a few examples of this, and some of them have been mentioned in the previous presentation. We have the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, and we have the political agenda clearly being pushed forward in early 2020. And actually, Strauss-Kahn actually said himself that COVID-19 was a narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. Other evidence, certainly in terms of the economic component of understanding of what might have been going on at a deeper level in relation to COVID-19, financial markets crisis, which I don't have time to go into, but the overall drive, Bank of International Settlements and other economic actors to move us towards central bank digital currency, potentially programmable, is another aspect of understanding COVID-19 as a structural deep event. Specific policies, digital ID, central bank digital currency, and of course the pandemic preparedness agenda, international health regulations, and, as I discussed earlier, the censorship industrial complex. All of these represent essentially an attempt to concentrate power. You can link them in and you can identify it to various actors during COVID-19, and which goes really points us in the direction of understanding COVID-19 primarily as an attempt to either instigate or exploit this proclaimed health emergency in order to push forward agendas. Now, I'm going to emphasize that I think that a lot of work needs to be done both in terms of systematically identifying interests, actors, and agendas, and crucially power networks in order to understand exactly what we're seeing in relation to the use of COVID-19 as a structural deep event. But there's a lot of evidence there, and this is certainly the way to go in terms of understanding the bigger political and economic processes which are underway. So just concluding comments. And sorry? Yeah, okay. So that's essentially my presentation, and as I have to move on, thank you very much.